And joining me now are four young Jewish politically active Canadians from different walks of life and different parts of the country for their perspectives on what's important in this federal election. So from Montreal, welcome to Annamie Koch, a conservative strategist who worked on Aaron O'Toole's leadership and now has his own consulting company. From Kingston, Ontario, Carolyn Svonkin, she's volunteering for the Liberals, and she's a poli-sci student at Queen's University. From Winnipeg, Sophia Hershfield, she's now in Toronto studying for her master's at U of T in English and Jewish Studies, and she's volunteering with the New Democrats. And from Toronto, Corey Shefman, a lawyer, currently volunteering as campaign manager for Annamie Paul of the Green Party in her Toronto Centre riding. Welcome to the CJN Daily.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Okay, so before we get started, you all have something in common, which is that you are connected to the Canadian Jewish Public Affairs Committee, CJPAC. So going around, we'll start with Anthony. Can you tell us how you got involved with this organization and where in your sort of personal political timeline did this Jewish advocacy organization come in?
It was actually fairly early on. So I got involved in politics. My first time was the 2015 campaign. So I was just knocking on doors in the West Island of Montreal. So if I ever needed a training on how to do sales, I guess that was it. Because let me tell you something, knocking on doors for the Conservative Party in the West Island of Montreal is definitely something. But anyway, that summer, so the summer of 2016, I was an intern on Parliament Hill in the opposition leader's office when Rona Ambrose was the interim leader. And I had made it very clear to a lot of people. I was at the time a very big, well, still am, but I'm saying very big Zionist, very big ally of the Jewish community. As you know, I converted to Judaism only later in life. And a bunch of people working on the Hill were like, we've got the perfect organization for you that you absolutely have to get involved in. Like, there's this organization called CJPAC. They're great. They bring young Canadians across the political spectrum together in Ottawa for a conference every year. So a year-long program. And it's all about, Jewish Canadian issues and support for the state of Israel. So that's really where it came from, is my political views were known. People said, this is the organization for you. And then from there, I was sort of plugged, and the rest is history.
Sophie?
Yeah, shout out to Camp Assad in Winnipeg, Manitoba. We had someone from CJPAC come and give this kind of political trivia workshop. And I was having the time of my life. And I very quickly realized that I was the only, 15-year-old camper at summer camp who's actually excited to talk about politics. And realizing that made me different from everyone else. And I got involved in CJPAC in high school. And then went back to it in university. So yeah, I've been political from a young age.
And Carolyn, tell us how you got into volunteering and working for the Liberals and how CJPAC fit in somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Sophie, I was also kind of the weird politics nerd for my whole life, like literally dating back to elementary school, when I would organize a mock election with my friends, and they're like, no, we don't care about this. We're 10 years old. But I was really into it. And then I really got involved more formally once I started university. I started attending Queen's Young Liberals events. And when 2019 rolled around, I started door knocking, canvassing, phone banking, all of the usual things. And I walked into the office one day, and the then president of the Queen's Young Liberals, who's a mentor of mine, said to me, oh, when you're done your CJPAC application, send it to me and I'll look it over.
Corey?
My dad took me to volunteer with our Liberal candidate in Thornhill when I was, I think I was 12 or 13 years old or something. And I was hammering in signs into lawns, and I basically never looked back. I was Liberal for a long time. I managed campaigns. I ran GoTV. I sort of did everything from the top to the bottom of campaigns in the Liberal Party. Worked on Joyce Murray's leadership campaign in 2013. And in 2015, I knocked on lots of doors in Winnipeg, where I was living at the time, talking about Justin Trudeau's promise to make 2015 the last election under first past the post. That was the selling point, no question about it. And then we all saw what happened after that. They lied, and they, really cynically arranged this thing to avoid having to fulfill that promise. And so I was politically without a home for a couple of years. And then Annamie Paul ran for the leadership of the Green Party. Annamie is the first Black woman and first Jewish woman to lead a federal political party. And I just popped into one of her, she called them Q and Annamie, like Q&A during the leadership race. And I asked her a couple of questions and I was hooked.
I want to know from you guys before we start throwing bombs here is how being Jewish.
Sorry about that.
No, it's important. We're going to do it. We're going to get there. But
on this way.
I need to ask you about something you just mentioned, which is how important is being Jewish or your Jewish values in terms of the work you're doing in politics? Where does it influence, or does it? Sometimes maybe it won't, but what is that? And I'll start with you, Anthony. Being Jewish, tikkun olam, Jewish values, things like that. Where does this play in?
Well, it's actually interesting because as I went through the process of my conversion and now finally, becoming Jewish, I've noticed a massive change in my own political values. I mean, I'm still very much a conservative, but I'd say the kind of conservative that I am has most definitely changed. I used to be much more of the exceedingly individualistic, more libertarian, just get out of my way, give me my free markets, let me make my money and leave me alone kind of guy. And I'm definitely still a pro-free market kind of person and all that jazz, but definitely much more of the old style Canadian Tory has made its way into my own personal political perspective. So, respect for tradition and all these sorts of things definitely being foundational to Judaism and foundational to my own political philosophy.
Sophie, can you take a stab at that from your going to Camp Masad and now here you are?
Yeah, of course, I'm happy to. For me, my Judaism has always been like intrinsically connected to my politics. Winnipeg is obviously a smaller Jewish community than Toronto, but it's an incredibly tight-knit Jewish community. And, for example, I went to Grey Academy, which is the Jewish school there. And, of course, it was a private school. There was tuition involved, except it was on a kind of a pay what you can scale. So anyone who couldn't afford to pay was still able to attend Grey Academy, and families were paying based on parental income, how many kids they had. They were given, breaks if they were new to Canada, things like that. It was very much, it was basically a system where the parents who were both doctors, were paying extra to support the people who had just come to the country, and things like that. And so that was always something I saw that was just built into my Jewish institutions. There was this, sense that we're going to help each other out so that we can all be a community together, and that everyone will contribute what they can so that we can all participate in this community. And I mean, my grandparents grew up in the north end of Winnipeg, and which was very much kind of the classic, like socialist Yiddish, that kind of Jewish community. And I feel like that's just always been a part of me. My Zeta worked as a lung doctor fighting tuberculosis outbreaks in, Indigenous communities. And I always really just saw that sense of wanting to give back, wanting to make things better, wanting to support those who need support as being part of his Jewish identity, but also just a part of what he did and what he was doing politically and with his work. So for me, it's just always been so hand in hand that there is that real sense of community and wanting to help people out and build a community and support those with the resources we have. So for me, it really has been just so natural to be a Jewish lefty. They've always gone hand in hand.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Carolyn, where did your Judaism fit in, if at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to start by echoing a lot of what Sophie said. I had a similar journey and upbringing where I grew up in a tight-knit Jewish community, especially at summer camp. And it seemed only natural that in a place where I had benefited so much from people taking care of each other and people who had more doing a little bit more to make sure that those who had less were all able to enjoy the same things, and that those values are intrinsically Jewish to me and also intrinsically progressive. As well, like I think many of us Jews despite maybe now being, at least in my family, a few generations out from being first generation immigrants, really identify with like the social security programs and all the things that were done to help like my grandparents and great grandparents come to Canada, feel welcome, and now be able a few generations later to have me in university and aspiring to a professional career and living a really comfortable, privileged life. And those kinds of programs, like I can see the value in so many of my friends and in my own family, and it would feel like turning my back on my history, partly as a Jew, to not support those and do everything I can to make sure any immigrant family, any immigrant coming to Canada has those same benefits and that same privilege. So it really has always been supernatural to me to be progressive. And I completely agree with Sophie that it's gone hand in hand. That being said, sometimes it's really hard to be a Jewish progressive. This summer, it was really hard to be a Jewish progressive and be a Zionist and be pro-Israel and either feel like you have to defend that or you have to justify it, or feel like there is a disconnect or there's a disconnect being placed upon you if you say you support Israel and yet you vote for a party that leans left, or maybe even has members in it that don't support Israel. Honestly, I don't have an answer to it. It's a conflict I really still think about every single day, but I do strongly believe that there is a really legitimate and important place for progressive Zionists, and it's not an oxymoron whatsoever. And I think that I hope in the future that will just become more and more clear. And I think I am glad, as much as this summer, for example, was really challenging to be Jewish, challenging to be progressive, but really wherever you stand on the Zionist spectrum politically, I think it was a hard place to be in and some hard things to see. I'm glad that that conversation has been brought up to the forefront. And I hope that it means that we can start talking about what does being a modern young person and supporting Israel look like, whether you're conservative, green, liberal, NDP, et cetera.
In terms of how my Jewishness informs, my Judaism informs my politics, I mean, I think it really comes back to me to two, maybe sometimes overused maxims. One is one that Erwin Kotler talks about a lot, and that's tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. And the idea that not only do you have to pursue justice, but you have to pursue justice in a just manner. And the second one is, like you said, Ellen, tikkun olam, healing the world. And for me, that's really what my Jewishness is about. I mean, I go to shul sometimes and I fast on Yom Kippur and I do the Seders. And I mean, I'm Jewish, but for me, my Jewishness is less about, scripture, and it's more about belief, and it's more about ethics. And I believe very strongly that we need to leave the world better off than we found it. And that's really how I found myself in the Green Party. We are in a climate crisis. And if, for me, one of the things that Annamie Paul says that really has resonated with this whole Jewish experience, and because of course she's Jewish as well, is that you can't have climate justice without social justice, and you can't have social justice without climate justice. They go hand in hand.
Okay, let's talk about some of the most important issues to young people, to you guys, that some were brought up in the debate and some were not. The most important thing that we should, not the most important thing, but let's go and ask for each of you, what is the key issue for you as a young active person, Jewish, in this election right now?
I mean, it's hard to say because on one hand, it's obviously COVID recovery. Like I think we're all young people on here. We can agree that COVID has been really unfair to us and to everyone. And I want to go back to my normal life at university. I want to have a job next year that I don't have to sit in my bedroom to do. So that's really important. And it's really impossible to look at this election and not focus on that first because it's right in front of our faces every single day. That being said, I'm also really sick of talking about COVID, which is another thing I think we can all agree on. So I would say beyond that, I think it's probably climate change. And I do think that got a lot of focus last night. Do I think all the answers and everything that people were saying were good? And do I think everything was addressed properly? No, I don't. But I was glad to see that people were talking about it. I was glad to see that there were some shots being fired and some of the hypocrisy of different parties and leaders was being called out. But I think, and I actually agree with Annamie Paul when she said there could be a whole debate on climate change because it is a massive issue. There's so much to talk about. And I would have liked to see a little more policy actually being talked about and why should you vote for any of these parties? What are the differences between them when you're talking about climate? It's not just who believes in climate change versus who doesn't. Like, I think we need to get a little bit past that, and we need to hold Canadians to the standard that they're a little bit past that too.
As a young person, climate change is genuinely horrifying to me. I do think about having kids, having grandkids, and whether or not we'll actually be able to live on the planet. You know, I'm not just thinking of, oh, do I want to retire in Winnipeg or in, you know, it's genuinely thinking, can I retire on planet Earth? Which is a really terrifying existential thought to have. But another thing that I do kind of want to touch on that was brought up just briefly in last night's debate was the kind of the people have been calling it like the second pandemic, which is the pandemic of drug overdoses. And to me, this is a really, really pressing issue as a young person. It is just heartbreaking. There have been, you know, especially throughout this past summer, throughout the pandemic, there have been a huge increase in drug overdoses, opioid drug overdoses, fentanyl overdoses. And even just going to, you know, I went to the University of Winnipeg, which is in downtown Winnipeg. And, you know, I would see the meth crisis in Winnipeg every single day that I was going to school. And it's just, to me, this is such an easily solvable issue. And it's being treated like a criminal issue when really it's just a healthcare issue and a mental health care issue. And to me, that I'm happy that it was touched on last night, even though it was just brief. But it really is something that is pressing.
Anthony, you tweeted that it's time to stop giving a lot more attention to seniors issues and more to people of Gen Z or young generation. And I want you to unpack that for us. Are you talking about affordability of housing and daycare and things like that?
Well, I'll give you the best example of this. I was excited yesterday when affordability became a topic because I figured, you know, maybe we're going to finally get into a little bit more issues that are specific to our, and right away, not for anything, but the person who asked the question was a senior who was saying, you know, that she was having difficulty paying for the house that she owned. And not to say that I'm not sympathetic, I am, and we absolutely need to have more supports for low-income seniors who are experiencing difficulties. But what I find irritating, I'll be quite frankly, as a young person, is that, you know, you have all these policies like Justin Trudeau bribing seniors with a free $500 freebie on the second day of the election campaign. Every time we have any discussion politically, I'll even tell you, like, quite frankly, the way housing is structured in this country is basically there's been a bit of a cahoots of all the political parties, whether explicitly or implicitly, to pursue policies that prevent any possibility of any sort of major correction in the housing market, okay, whatsoever, to allow people our age to have any semblance of greater affordability when it comes to lodging. And what I'm saying is, I understand that seniors compose a large portion of the population. By 2030, that portion of the population is going to be even larger than it is now. I understand that seniors vote at a much larger rate than younger people do, okay, which, you know, creates a sort of incentive for political parties. They know where their bread is buttered, okay? I get it. But we ended up in this sort of perverse cycle that exists in Canadian politics, which is political parties don't speak to issues that matter to young people. Young people don't vote. So political parties don't speak to the issues of young people.